Hey guys, welcome to Hope It Helps. And my guest on the show today is Miss Cheryl King. Cheryl, welcome to the show.
Hey, nice to meet you again. How you doing?
I'm all good. Thank you so much for your time and for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. So, Cheryl, I found out about you actually probably about a month ago when you did the webinar about the future of podcasting in the Middle East. And the data that you were sharing, like about where's the market now, where's it going, and your background in like broadcast media, I'm like, this sounds really interesting. So I'm like, I'd love to have you on the show to understand, like, because you have an understanding of what this industry is. So it'd be really cool to have someone who has more of an understanding, not just someone who's doing a show, like understands about the business and so on.
Oh, thank you.
No, thank you. But before we get into all that, why don't you give all of us just a little bit of background about yourself and we'll take it from there.
Gosh, wow. Okay. Literally from the ear dot. I don't know. I'll start halfway through.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, I guess so. I've been in the region now like for 6 years, which definitely I was one of those expats that came over for like thinking I was going to be here for 1 year, just have an adventure, like hopefully make some money, and then just travel a little bit and then sort of head back to the UK. But sort of 6 years on and like I'm still absolutely loving it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, I suppose my kind of journey started, I mean, I've always been interested in media and reaching people in different kind of innovative ways, I guess. So I sort of first started back a small PR agency in Birmingham after doing my English degree. And it was fun. Like I kind of wanted to, I knew that I wanted to do something, but I didn't really know what. I was
What you want to do. Yeah.
classically one of those graduates. I did an English degree and came out thinking, right, I guess I should be a teacher. But actually I probably wasn't so much thinking that. So I thought about, okay, maybe I could be getting to journalism, advertising, and PR, like was this really sort of slightly random left field thing that I thought wasn't really a proper career.
Okay.
So, but anyways, like after doing a bit of work experience, I found that I loved writing. Like that was my kind of default to go to. And I thought I kind of was quite passionate about how you could translate like the written word and how you could actually use it to achieve coverage and make an impact for a brand.
Okay.
So I started out in a small agency in Birmingham, but I think whilst I was there, like I always sort of thought, if you're going to be good at a job, if you're going to be amazing in this field, you have to be down in London. That was where the bright lights
hub.
were.
Yeah,
And
sure.
it was where all the people, all the best people were. And I've always been super driven and very competitive with myself. So, I went down to London and I spent sort of 6 months traveling. Like, so I was very kind of, I think I came back thinking, literally, I can take on the world. Like, I can do anything. Like, the world's my oyster. So I had probably a bit of arrogance a bit about me. I was like, yeah, I can do this. So I moved down to London. I'm very much a kind of there's a bit of a country bumpkin, very sheltered up until that point in my life, like early 20s. I hadn't really been out of my hometown. Like the trajectory for where I lived was that you basically didn't really leave, so you stayed there. So that was, for me, it was quite scary moving to sort of the big city and to this huge kind of PR company I went to, which was amazing, but finding out suddenly there's like 100 people that are vying for a job that can do equally if not better a job as you. So it was very competitive, but I learned so much, and I worked for a company called Marketeers, which was a broadcast specialist. So slightly different to a sort of traditional PR agency. And we worked with brands to get them onto the radio, onto TV, and online. And it was just exciting. And we had sort of all these different radio studios where we worked. We had a TV studio, and we worked with all these kind of celebrities. And it was definitely like a work hard, play hard kind of environment.
Sounds like it.
It was intense, and I loved it there. But then after a few years, I sort of felt that I missed my kind of traditional sort of PR roots. I went to a tech agency, and I wanted to work for a one with like networked offices, so I could move around the world and just travel a little bit more, really. So I went to a brilliant agency called Lewis PR and worked under a guy called Chris Lewis, who was like a former FT journalist, and he was like hardcore. Probably,
I can imagine.
He was like the scariest person I'd ever worked with. And we used to come in every morning at 8 o'clock and we sit down, we do the press briefing, and we go through all the newspapers. And sometimes he'd be like, so Cheryl, what's the stock market looking like for this client? And if you didn't know that information, like off the top of your head, like that would just be like, you might as well not even hang around. So he was quite a taskmaster to work for. But at the same time, like I learned so much of discipline, like working for them. And then yeah, then kind of I was there for a year, and just this weird sort of crazy opportunity came up whilst I was there, and my ex-partner had a job offer to move to Dubai to work for Emirates, and it was amazing. Like, and it would literally happen so quickly. Like, this random request came in. 2 days later, he was flying business class across to Dubai, given the whole kind of like experience, and it was one that was really too much of an exciting one to miss, really. So
Sure.
I think we thought about it for actually about a couple of weeks, because at that point in time we'd just bought a house, but also my dad's wife wasn't very well. She was quite sick, so it was just a strange time to make quite a big decision to sort of up sticks.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And leave. But yeah, anyways, we did. In the end, it was the right thing to. I mean, it was such an amazing opportunity to go there, and we always thought, right, if it doesn't work out, we'll just come back. And it's
True.
6 hours from home. You can always jump on a plane. So I sent my CV across to a recruitment agency, and it just so happened weirdly that my now boss, he runs Marketeers again, who I used to work for at that point. He was in this recruitment agency office at the time because he was quite good friends with the guy that ran it. When I sent my CV through, it went to this one of the guys that worked on the comms desk, and he picked it up and he went, "Cheryl King, Marketeers." And my boss was there, and he went, "Yeah, I know her." He was like, "Oh, she's just shared her CV with us. Like, she's looking to move out here." And he was like, "Send it to me."
Yeah.
And then fast forward a few months, I'd met up with him for coffee, and basically he said, "Right, we've got an opportunity for you to run and build an office in Dubai from scratch, and we want you to be the person to do it." So yeah, that was basically it. And then fast forward 6 years, and here we are.
Here we are.
Yeah.
Wow. It's thrown straight into the lines then with that one. Like, yeah, from just working in PR to like, go open an office for us in a new country.
It was crazy. And like, that was, for sure, it was like my big break, if you can think of a break in your career. Like, before that, I was doing fine, like, but I wasn't remarkable. I was just one of many cogs in a big machine, basically. And at that point, I remember feeling so kind of a lot of weight on my shoulders and a lot of pressure to do well, but also super excited because we were introducing something very new to the region. Like, Marketeers is a broadcast specialist, broadcast back in 2014 when I moved out. It was quite in its infancy in terms of how it works with brands. So, video news content, placing that on sites was different. We were lucky enough. I mean, it was hard the first couple of years.
Yeah, I can imagine.
We didn't really make any money, and we think I was propped up very much by the London office, and I was literally working in an office just with one desk by myself, just literally calling people up going, "Hi, can we introduce you to this, like, broadcast specialist services?" And everyone's putting the phone down saying, "Great, it sounds good, but you've got no creds out here. No one
There's
really
no
knows."
traction behind it. Yeah.
So I mean, it was only really like, constantly having like a long list of people to call, and every day being persistent, and slowly like getting one client, then you do a good job, and then you get another client, and two more come up, and then slowly you work. But yeah, it was like hard, but, and a journey, but an amazing one as well. And now we're busy, and we're working with some amazing brands on some really cool stuff.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a great story. That's a great story from starting there and to end up like here. Who would have thought that that's where you'd be after all these years. I wanted to come back to, so you guys are a specialist broadcast consultancy. Now, I don't know what that means. So
don't worry, my parents don't either.
So could you explain to us? So let's say I'm a company. I come to you as a client. I want to work with you guys. What are the services that you offer me? What is that like? What does that all entail?
Yeah, I guess, I say probably a good elevator pitch in a way, or a way to sum it up in a nutshell is we're like a brand funded news agency, or a brand funded newsroom. So if you think about journalists or whatever, we're constantly working with different clients to get them on the news in a positive way and in a controlled way. So say, for example, you're a financial company, and you know that you're sometimes the briefs we get is, we just want to make this famous. Like, we want to make this story everywhere. We want to be on Reuters, the BBC, we want to be on the Times, and our job is to think about how can we get you there.
Okay.
through editorial coverage, so not through paid for. So how can we
organically?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So we've worked on some really cool stuff. So for example, we worked on a big project around Dubai Design Week a couple of weeks ago, and that again was a similar brief. We had to work with all these different assets and create all these kind of stories that will then land coverage internationally. And sometimes it's with anyone. It's like Xinhua News Agency in China, it's Channel 7 in Australia, like Deutsche Welle, ABC. So we basically work, and I think it's been cool the last year, definitely. I think our role has sort of pivoted quite a bit. So I feel like we're working on kind of behalf of Brand Dubai and the UAE to sometimes extol the messaging. So we're actually sort of managing the coverage and how the world sort of perceives this country. And
that's interesting.
It's been super fun. We did over the years, we worked on the PayPal visit to the UAE back in February last year, and that was insane. Our job then was to basically manage all the broadcast coverage coming out of it and to make sure we were telling the right stories in the right way and controlling the message in a year that was interesting. We had the Catholic Church, we had the Grand Imam coming across. There was lots of kind of negative stories coming out about things at that point, and our job was to make sure every single piece of broadcast coverage was positive, and that it told the story of the year of tolerance and peace and unity and all these different messaging through broadcast.
Okay, that's interesting.
That answers your question.
No, it did. So you guys, I'm a brand, and I come to you, I'll be like, Cheryl, I want to be in, like you said, Reuters, Forbes, whatever that might be, and then you guys write the content that you think would get picked up by them. Is that how it works?
Exactly.
Okay, I got you. Yeah.
So you might be I want to, you might not even be as granular as I want to be on these channels. It might be I want people to think a certain way about this brand, or you might be, a credit card company, and I want to sort of shift sentiment so people think of us more as a tech company rather than just a finance company.
Okay.
So it's really cool, and the briefs we get are so diverse. And for the one we worked on recently around Dubai Design Week, that was sort of telling the stories of all these different graduates that had come together to actually create social impact ideas that will change the way we live. And the job was to sort of to raise awareness of that specific brand, but also to kind of tell those unique stories in a kind of more in-depth way, and to really kind of ultimately encourage more universities over the next few years to kind of apply for this program. So a lot of it is there's sentiment, there's raising awareness, that there's changing perception as well. One of our clients is used to be thought of as a facilities management company. They wanted to be changed, that the kind of idea to be thought of something differently. So we're doing a lot of work to get them to there, and you can do that through media, through podcasts as well, which we were saying, even through this year we've been doing loads more kind of virtual live streaming. So
of course. For
obvious reasons. So everything we're doing now, if there's a press conference, if there's a huge announcement, in days of old, when everyone would do a massive physical event to launch something like a car brand, now it's all virtual. And that's really it's fun to do, because it feels like now we're bringing tech into
all that.
And it's
sure.
Moving the PR industry along as well, because I think before this region sort of has a bit of a legacy for being known as a bit of a press release factory, and you'd write press releases, journalists just pick them up verbatim, and it's okay, great, now you've got your 50 piece of coverage, thank you for that. But it's actually now looking at different ways and being innovative and sort of ditching the rule book and doing things differently. And I think, if anything, this year has kind of forced us all to think beyond the traditional and more engaging ways that we can do things.
And I think that's a very good point, not just from your side as the creatives that are doing this, but I think also from the client side. They've realized that, like I said, this year everything changed and everything's online, so trying to be in maybe a newspaper now is probably not the best way to be going about this. We should be focusing more on the online and to switch all that up. And when you said about changing the perception, so I get raising awareness is one thing. And that's probably, you can, through the social media channels and so on, you can do that. But I think to change the entire perception of what your company was and the image behind it and stuff, to make it something new, can be quite challenging.
Yeah.
So how does that, how does that start? How do you even start making that change? And I'm sure that's not going to happen in one post, 2 posts. This is a long-term thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it is a challenge, and it's definitely not an overnight awareness thing where you just sort of press a button and suddenly, great, we now all think this and we used to think this.
Exactly.
So it's definitely like a longer term strategy. But I mean, yeah, how do you go about doing that? I mean, it's a lot of things that go into it. I think probably the way we would approach it is firstly understanding what that perception is, doing media audits, doing kind of a focus group to understand where the current land lies, and also then having a clear focus on, right, what do you want to be known as? What does your messaging look like? And then how can we get you to that? So it might be the routes to doing so might be just through a really kind of targeted media relations campaign where we're really sort of focusing on different stories that position you in a different way. Or if you're known, for example, as not really being a thought leader, giving you a voice and a subject and a topic that you're passionate about that you can own and lead. And then the tactical ways to do it, I think there's so many different ways. TV still obviously has a huge footprint here. Radio actually in certain areas of the Middle East reaches more households than TV though. So there's ways to think of it from that side. But then also like looking at stakeholders and how you can use people and your advocates to help you change perception. And then bringing that in through social media, I think, and I guess probably the main thing is knowing your audience too, because
knowing the audience,
once you know where they are, then it's easy to target them. So if you're a B2B brand, if you're business driven, LinkedIn is a really
amazing,
powerful platform.
For sure.
And I know that you use it a lot, and same as me. So
my life is on LinkedIn.
Yeah, it's crazy, right? And even we've done this region more than others, I feel like LinkedIn's like the de facto platform to be on. I think we've probably done business on LinkedIn. We've actually secured, I think, the opportunity to speak with Ali on the last webinar that came through a LinkedIn connection.
LinkedIn.
So, yeah, it's good. So I think there's good ways, and it's good to see how this region sort of really, I think, embracing different means to communicate, and how it's so quick as well. And that's one thing I love about here. Yeah. It's just speedy to do things.
Yeah, I think that's actually a very good point, because I think there's a there's a lag time in adoption, but once it's there, it takes off like a rocket. So everyone gets on it, everyone starts using it, and it becomes the new norm, pretty much.
That's so true. Yeah.
And one thing you said earlier that was interesting, because I had a question about it. So TV and radio. Now, in the history of broadcast media, we started with the radio.
Yeah.
Then we moved on to the TV, so that was now the new hot thing. And then came social media, and now we have podcasts. And what you said was interesting, that TV in this part of the world and radio in other parts of the Middle East are still quite relevant. So I was thinking, I'm like, moving forward now with podcasts, with social media, there's so many ways to broadcast content. Do you think in a couple of years the traditional ways like TV and radio are still going to be viable, or do you think we're going to get to a point that tech has advanced so much, we're so ingrained in all these platforms and all these new ways to consume it, that's not going to be useful anymore?
Yeah, that's a really good question. But I think yes, they will. They'll definitely still be relevant, and they'll still be winning big. I think what I think is interesting now is that, for example, NBC, it actually has more of its audience are online than actually traditional consuming content. So more people are actually consuming content for NBC through social media rather than actually traditionally sitting in front of the TV and watching a program. And that's how it will go. Definitely it's the merger, it's conversion media. So it's how the media sort of blurring the boundaries and how things are pivoting. Even, podcasts now, they're becoming Apple, for example. One thing they're doing to try and wrangle a bit of the lion's share of viewership from Spotify is to actually create series out of their own Apple podcast. That's their intention. That's why they have Apple that's one of the reasons why they have Apple TV.
Sure.
So they're looking to kind of it's just the different ways that media, I think, are moving and finding different platforms to kind of make themselves relevant. But when you think of I don't know, ARN, for example, and radio, you can consume that through so many different platforms. For when we're in the office, we listen to Virgin and Dubai 92 through laptops and through our TV screens. And then there's the different ways that media is sort of moving beyond that. Gulf News, for example, has its Gulf News Reach online platform. Arabian Business did AB Live. It had its podcast arm to it as well. The National has a podcast too. So I think it's exciting for media at the moment, because they're kind of operating outside of the four walls of maybe what they're known for, and they have to do that, because if they don't, they'll fail. They won't be competitive. audience habits are changing. You know, I think it's weird as well, because there's a lot around like snackable content now. Like people's attention spans are getting shorter.
Like
so
TikTok, for example, like the king of that. Yeah,
for sure. And then like through IG Live and Instagram, like 15-second pieces. And then, so that's one way like to reach like the youth culture. But then also like podcasts have come along as this kind of not really new kid on the block, because they've been around since 2005, but they're sort of relevant now more so.
Exactly.
And they're longer. Like, you know, this podcast isn't 15 seconds. It's going to
Definitely
be definitely the way like we're talking. But yeah, it's like, it's crazy how like that it's defying like the trend for shorter content, because podcasts are kind of completely different. And that's, you know, there's like, you know, This American Life, when that came on board and sort of really, I think, put podcasts on the map in terms of real kind of binge watch listening popular content like that. They were long. And then, you know, Joe Rogan's podcast, some of them are like 3 hours, right?
Yeah, I don't know how he does 3 hours, to be honest.
Exactly. And so that kind of changes things. But yeah, it's just how media is just moving, and how audience like habits are completely changing. And again, this year as well, I think with people being on lockdown, having more time on their hands, that's where podcasts have won big. And I think radio and TV is thinking about how they move and what their next steps are. So yeah.
One thing you said actually that I didn't pay attention to that's so true is that, like you said, there's a big push right now for snackable content. So like 15 seconds, TikTok, quick, you consume it and you want more and more and more. But at the same time, the popularity of podcasts are increasing, which are much longer. So it's weird to have those two things going on at once. Why do you have a lack of attention here, but you have more of attention here? Is it maybe the content? Do you want to listen more to a conversation? What do you think is the reason that those two things almost shouldn't exist at the same time? Do you understand what I mean? It's weird.
It is super. Yeah, it is strange. And but I think people just, I think if you go back to what people listen to and what they're looking for. So when you think about snackable content, it's always quick. You know, when you're on Instagram, you're scrolling, your attention span is short. Like that's a lot of the time why they do like text. Even on Facebook, when you watch a video, they have the text on the video, because a lot of people don't actually listen with their sound on. So
so you'll just read along.
You're just reading it. But your attention span there is maybe because the content perhaps isn't quite as like is specific or targeted. You're just scrolling down, so you want something that's just going to hook you in. You know, if they haven't got you within the first few seconds, you switch off. And that's like, I mean, and that works for like the generations coming up. So the Gen Y, whatever version of generation we're on now, like they're literally like that works for them, because they're of that culture which is like instant gratification. That's where TikTok wins big, but podcasts as well. Like that's, I think, completely different. And when you listen to a podcast, you know, you're not an accidental listener. You don't just happen upon a podcast. You listen to it because you have a very specific like interest in that one. Like, you know, if you're interested in a podcast around, I don't know, psychology or business or sport or whatever, then you're going to be focused on that, and you're going to have an interest in it. So therefore, I would say it's, you know, the longer form content works because it's playing to everything that you're keen on. But yeah, I mean, the rates for like consumption on podcasts, like I think 93% of people that listen to a podcast finish it. So
wow, that's huge.
It's massive.
That's really big.
And like even in this region, I think the average length of podcast is about like 48 minutes. So on that, like if people are listening to most of that, then, and even for like a brand, like, cause that's the way we come at it, you can say a lot in that time. So
of course,
it's huge. So
one thing that you were talking about, like, you're so right. You don't accidentally like listen to a podcast. It's not like music. You're on the radio, a song comes on that you weren't planning to listen to, and you're like, and then you find out about it. A podcast is a very targeted thing that you're going out to seek. But I think the contrast between the two, because I think all of us, but like you said, the younger generation, for sure, it's snackable content for sure. But I think like in the older generations, you find that the snackable content's cool and it can be addictive, and I can stay on TikTok for like an hour, like, not gonna lie, just like scrolling. It's endless entertainment. But I think with podcasts, why there might be a big push towards it is value. What's your, like, this I'm watching for entertainment, but this I'm listening to or watching for genuine value. I want to get something from this, whether it's an insight, whether it's a tool, whether it's just something I'm passionate about, there's some value that I'm going to come out of that. I think that might be the contrast between the two.
Yeah, absolutely. You're listening to be informed, you're listening to educate yourself, and you're listening to get something from it. So yeah, you're listening to it. Your kind of motivations for listening to are probably quite different. And there's so many different platforms now. Like, I mean, it's been great to see like this year, like Angami sort of come into the mix as like for this region, from this region, and then you've got like the usual suspects of Spotify and the Apple out there, and it's really good. And like we work with this one brand, Finyal Media, and they basically have this big podcast network just for Arabic speakers, and they create like Arabic fiction series, and it's great to see what they're doing as content creators and curators, that they're putting that together and having very dedicated like specific content. And you see podcasts winning massively in Saudi as well, like
huge.
There's a huge audience there. And it's good to see like these, because I guess like in the UK, for example, we have Ofcom, that regulates everything to the nth degree. Like there's nothing here at the moment anyways for podcasting. So it's this big sort of open forum, unregulated forum that people can speak in a very kind of unapologetic, very free manner
exactly.
that people are loving. And podcasts win big with like youth as well as like with older people as well. Like the split is pretty much, there's not really much in it, so it's good to see. Like I think there's a podcast for anything you're interested in
by now. For sure, literally anything from cooking to therapy to anything in between, you'll find something 100%. In the webinar, there was a couple of points I wanted to pick up on because I thought they were very interesting. One thing you said was the younger listeners, like the younger generation, for example, they don't relate to mainstream media or like typical media. That's why TikTok and like maybe even our age, like TikTok, like all the podcasts, that's why we're interested in them, because it's not what we don't relate to the typical thing. So I was trying to think, has that always been the case? Because think about it, in the past you only had like radio, you only had TV. So did younger people not relate to it even then, or now because you have so many new ways to consume content, has it become much more prevalent now?
I think I guess younger people coming up now, they're just, the whole media landscape is so different. They're growing up as worldly citizens when you're bombarded so much with so much content. It's an overload, and
it is.
And social media, you think you wake up in the morning, first thing you do, you check your phone. You got 50 WhatsApp messages, you got Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, like all these things coming at you. And I think it's crazy now. I mean, my nephew, he's 9, and he's already kind of swiping on an iPad.
Like a pro.
Exactly. And it's a completely different set of media, and I think it can be dangerous. There's so much content coming at people, and to be able to navigate that, and I guess that it does sort of coincide with publishing houses struggling a little bit, like print media has sort of struggled. People aren't picking up a paper as much as before and going away reading it for a couple of hours, like that. How we consume content is completely changing, and then all of a sudden, against this backdrop, you've got people are becoming TikTok stars overnight. It's really interesting how it's so different now. But then radio is still like is still powerful. Like the Chris Fade show there's more listeners than ever. Like Dubai 92, there's like lots of content there, and then you've also got like the big players, your BBCs, your Reuters, your Sky News of the world, that's continuing to sort of create or deliver amazing journalism and give some great sort of content. So I think it's just different ways that people are consuming content now, and it'll be interesting to see how, if we get more platforms like TikTok, there's so many different ones. And I think like what Spotify and Apple are doing as well in terms of like the audio space is going to be one to keep an eye on. And I think even what we see, probably what's going to happen in the next 5 years, is there's going to be voice-based search as well. So Alexa, find me a podcast on this, or whatever.
True. So
sure. That'll be like how media continues to keep converging. And I think it's just such a different game to be in now than perhaps like 10 years ago. But I think for people that work in the PR industry and comms industry, like for us, it keeps you on your toes, because it's contracting in a way. Like, I know there's so many media houses now that have sort of had to reduce workforces because of this year. They're not doing as much content as before. So it's making everyone, I think, on the flip side, on the positive side, like think differently and try new things and experiment with new things. And it's all online. And that's, of course, how things will continue to go.
Yeah. And I think like you made a very good point that the landscape of people growing up now and like even how we grew up completely changed to like our parents' generation, for example. And like you said, it can be overwhelming. And this is what I was thinking about. I'm like, okay, with a TV station, with a radio station, that with each one, there's kind of a message you're pushing. Behind all the news that I'm pushing, there's a certain agenda I'm trying to push, whether it's radio, whether it's that. And there's rules that govern that. So I couldn't come on like a TV station and talk about something that goes completely against like what their brand is. So with podcasts though, like you said, it's very authentic, it's very natural. And a lot of the times if it's not company based, it's a person like myself or like many other people. So you get access to so many different opinions and views on anything, on any topic and so on. And like you said, that can be overwhelming. So you know how now there's all that over the last few years, like what's real news, what's fake news, and all this kind of stuff coming on. So it can, like you said, it's positive because you have access to so many more opinions. But I believe it's now, if anything, 10 times harder to formulate your own. What do you think?
Yeah, or is it? I don't know. I mean, or does that just equip you with more, I guess, points of, exactly, like perspective. So you have a bit more information so you can think, okay, actually, like then this is what I think because I've listened to multiple different views on something. But yeah, I mean, you know, there's always an agenda, right? I think with any sort of media, so trying to sort of sift through the noise, I think, and figure out what you think. It's not easy. And, you know, there's sort of the Daily Mail culture back in, not just the UK, but everywhere where, you know, this so kind of pushing people down a specific way and making people think certain way about people, things, ideologies, their political bias, you know, what they think about gender, what they think about, you know, left or right wing. Like it definitely it infiltrates, you know, the media is hugely powerful, like to like an absolute massive degree. Like it's kind of supports elections, like the political landscape, you know, propaganda. It was used in times of old to kind of convince people to do something or behave a certain way or to convince people to follow a certain political ideology. So there's of course, like free speech is hugely important, but with the media, there's they're controlled by very specific like media houses, and they're always pushing the, you know, the party line. But I guess it must be. I think it's sort of finding out you're right. The media outlets that you sort of feel reflect your views. Like, I mean, I love reading the BBC because I feel that is. Reports obviously 100% has its own, and there's a known sort of spin on certain things, but at least you feel like you're getting a bit of factual information at some point. So, but I guess there's so much there, and I think the media has a huge role in terms of shaping what we think about things, and that's why it's such a powerful, influential tool.
For sure. No, it makes sense. I think at the end of I think you made a good point. Like, you are open to so many more perspectives now because you have access to all this. I think it's just figuring out what, you know, trying to sift through everything and figure out, okay, this is what I think, or I believe this channel fully reflects what I, you know, support and believe at the end of the day.
And taking things with a bit of a pinch of salt as well. Like, I know when I speak to my parents back home and they're like, oh, did you see the papers? And did you see the headline on this? And you're like, well, you may think that, but actually read this and it may change what you think about things. So, and it just shows you how polarized some media can be. But
no, exactly. I wanted to come back to the whole podcast discussion. So a lot of, like you said earlier, a lot of companies and a lot of brands now have a podcast. And I know you guys have one too, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But I went to a podcast workshop before I started all this. It was by, her name is Hiba Fisher. She's the CEO of Current Cultures. And I've had her on the podcast. She's amazing.
Yeah, she's awesome.
So she did a whole podcast workshop for like one day, and I went to it before I launched mine. And when I was there, the interesting thing was, and that was my first like wake up call, that I was the only one there that was there to start like my own podcast as an individual. Everyone else was there from a company. So clearly I'm like, so podcasts are not a big thing for like a company. But the thing I was trying to understand is, why is there such a big push for that now? That's what I'm trying to understand. I'm like, is it because a podcast is supposed to be free? It's supposed to be authentic. And I don't know when it's coming from a brand, if you can still achieve that same feel. Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And like, you're right, like they are completely like they're meant to be authentic, but then I think from a brand perspective, that is a huge bonus because they're trusted. Like they're one of the most trusted forms of medium, so that's the kind of excitement for brands. I think what we've seen as well, internal comms is a massive opportunity for podcasts as well, and we work with quite a few different aviation brands and tech brands when it comes to podcasts, because you think, you know, if you think about I don't know, an airport for example, and so many kind of people are disparate, your whole workforce is on different locations. You might have some people literally on the runway, like other people in the back office, other people in like another country, and you've got all these people that are just so kind of disparate and they're not together. Like, so how do you communicate as a business with all these people? And like, yes, you can send out an email newsletter, yes, you can try and do a town hall meeting, but is it actually effective? You know, how are you going to get all these people together at the same time? So I think podcasts by their nature work so well for that. So how do you speak to people easily? Well, you look at the one common device to all. You know, everyone has a smartphone. Podcasts are mobile first. Yeah, they are. You can, you can download them when you're on Wi-Fi. You can listen to them at your leisure. It's radio on demand in essence. So that's a great way to speak to people. And if you're thinking of a brand, you know, how can you sort of speak to that many people? Very simply, well, one, through a podcast, and they're known to have a lot more transparency. You know, when sometimes you listen to a video, you think, oh, how many times has that been edited? You know, how polished is it? Or, you know, the guy looks like he's reading off an auto cue. But, you know, podcasts, as you mentioned, it's authentic. You know, you're having a conversation, and that's a huge way to speak to people. So I think, yeah, from a brand perspective, internal comms and podcast work amazingly well. And then from a kind of external comms perspective, so thinking about your message out to people, again, a huge opportunity there. But I think I don't think brands always necessarily have to have, like, I don't know, the Emirates MBD podcast or the PwC podcast. You know, it could be something a lot more subtle. We work with a legal firm, and we've got this podcast with them, which is doing amazingly well, and it's called The Case Files.
Okay. So that's a great name.
But yeah, it's a decent one. That's thanks to the guys in London. But it's basically about all these kind of horror stories that have happened, or these legal horror stories that have happened, and we get the actual people that are involved in the stories. It might be this. I know we did one about this doctor who'd perform these kind of unnecessary operations on his patients, which was super creepy.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. But then like the people came on board and they talked about it, and then they had the legal representative came on afterwards from the brand to say, well, it was how it was managed, and this is how we, you know, brought justice upon this. And they kind of had a whole discussion about it, and it's just really interesting human kind of stories, connections and content that people that really resonate with people, and they can tell it really powerfully through a podcast. So the kind of brand becomes almost sort of more subtle, but the inference is that right, these guys know what they're doing. So if I have a problem, or if I'm looking for legal advice, I can go to this brand. You know, they're trusted, you know, they know what they're doing, they're experienced, and then that's one way for a brand. So less kind of, you know, throwing it down people's faces, you know, the brand itself, like keeping it a little bit more subtle, and you make much more engaging content, because, you know, you're never going to search for a podcast from a specific brand just because it's the brand. You know, it's the content that's going to get you there. So yeah, and I think that's a good thing. And then, you know, they're measurable. That's also why it's good for brands. Like, you can easily tell how many people have listened to a podcast, how many, where they're from as well. There's tools now where you can look at what countries they're from, how long people listen to it as well. You know, you can look at views. So kind of from a sort of business outcome, it has really powerful stats, and traditional ways to PR. Like, sometimes you think, okay, I'll get a nice piece of content in 3 newspapers, and you're just looking at like arbitrary metrics, like, you know, advertising value equivalent figure, which doesn't work, and then like you get reach. So it's just like, it's good ways. So I think there's just the way I can see why Heber had lots of brands in that podcast workshop, because the people are getting quite excited about what they can do with them.
Yeah. But something you said that I didn't consider, because I thought, okay, it's a company or a brand that's gonna make a podcast. I thought the podcast would be, I don't know why I thought this, but I thought it'd be like, we're talking about like our brand. How do we make this product? Or 1, 2, 3, something like that. But using that case files example, that's a great way to connect it to that, because that's something I want to listen to. I'd be interested to listen to, and it connects to your brand. But like you said, I'm not shoving it down your throat. It's very authentic. It's a story. It's something, something you can relate to.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
I never considered that. I thought it was much more like tactile and, okay, we'll only talk about the brand.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I would say definitely not. I mean, I think there's probably our podcast a bit about that, but I would imagine their listeners are probably not so great. But yeah, then there's ones like, for example, MasterCard does this amazing podcast in the US, and it's called Fortune Favors the Bold. And it's basically all around financial inclusion, but it's told in such a cool, kind of gritty, like urban way. And they have this amazing host that sort of has come on board to do it. And she's a former journalist. And they've got this trailer as well that they've, a video trailer that they filmed for it. And it's all filmed in like New York City, and it's like black and white, and it's got this really cool music. And it's just these like really interesting stories around finance, but told in like a really powerful, like, it's not at all vanilla way. Like, it's actually really great content, and they're doing some amazing stuff. And definitely I think brands that can tell a story, like for example Volkswagen has one, Canon Middle East has one called Shutter Stories, and it's all around like stories from photographers, and like how do you capture the perfect
cool.
picture. So it's not like, oh, come and buy our cameras from Canon. It's like, actually, I'm a wildlife photographer, and if you want to capture an amazing kind of scene, this is what you need to do. So that's, I think, the way. And as a listener, listeners aren't, they're not fools. Like, we listen because we're interested, and we'll switch off if we aren't. So the inference for the brand to do it is that you kind of by default, it's a brand funded podcast, but you'll think favorably about that brand from it. And then perhaps when you are looking for your next camera, you're like, okay, well, these guys obviously know what they're talking about.
Yeah, no, exactly. No, that's a very, very good point. And all the names you mentioned for those podcasts sound great. Whoever's been naming them has been spot on. I love them.
It's so hard though. Like we're trying to always come up with different names for podcasts, and we're doing one at the moment, and it's just like brainstorming constantly. And sometimes we're like, oh, we have a great idea. We're like, how about this? And it's like, so yeah, it's fun doing that.
And you guys launched your own podcast. Is it the 4DC podcast? Is that the podcast that you guys launched, or have I got that wrong?
No, we have like a few. I mean,
okay. There's more than one.
Okay. I think we have a couple. Like, I know we kind of do. We have like one that we're launching at the moment in MENA, but a lot of the time we're on other people's podcasts, and I think that's what we've been saying for brands as well. Like, sometimes there's always an eagerness to produce and default to produce straight away. Like, right, I want to have my own podcast. Everyone's doing a podcast, so let's do our own. But sometimes actually what makes more sense to be on other people's. So we did one of our clients is called Tourism Island, and they've just been on the Dukan Show podcast, kind of talking about that, with which has been a good one. So thinking about leveraging other people's podcasts and followings is always good. I think Rania Nawaz has one called When Women Win.
I've heard of that one.
So it's brilliant, actually, a brilliant podcast. And being a guest on that podcast, then suddenly you're accessing all of her subscribers.
Exactly.
So,
yeah, no, that's true. That's actually that's a smart way. It's not just about, don't think just about producing it.
Yeah.
Find other ways to get into the podcasting world without necessarily having to like make a podcast. You can be like the podcast guest that everyone speaks to.
Exactly. And then like you're kind of you're not having to build up your audience from scratch. So because it is a time investment, like as you kind of know with doing your podcast, like you're constantly doing content. So rather sometimes than starting from scratch, unless you're prepared to really sort of take it seriously and really put your time and effort in, sometimes that's the way. But yeah, we've kind of got our own podcast, but it's good as well, sort of, almost being observers and kind of looking at the ecosystem and sort of helping people navigate their way through it too.
Sure. So do you guys help companies, let's say I'm a brand, I came to you, and you guys would help produce the podcast for us? Or is that is that how it works? So like the brainstorming, the content, or like walk us through like what would that look like?
Yeah, so yeah, exactly as you say. So we would work with you on in terms of literally piecing that podcast together from like start to finish.
Okay.
So it's fun actually. Like as you kind of get your skin under the feet, get your feet under the skin. I can't even think of how to say it now, but you get underneath it. That's what I was trying to say. But yeah, you look at like what the kind of goals are of that podcast, who the audience is that you want to reach, and you start mapping out what does that content look like? What does success look like? You know, is it downloads? Is it you're trying to change sentiment? Is it you're trying to make people think a certain way? Are you trying to mobilize a behavior? And once you kind of know that, then you can start thinking about, right, you know, what does our host look like? So who do we want to speak to? You know, is it from who are we? Is it from Africa or Middle East? You know, what audiences are we trying to attract? So therefore, the host needs to represent that.
Yeah.
Then from a content perspective, you know, trying to figure out like what we want to say and make it as engaging as possible, and having a point to every episode. And that's just kind of the production part of it. But then I guess the sort of fun part and also the most effective part is once you've done your podcast is trying to distribute it properly and promote it and measure it. So I think there's about 18 different aggregator sites. There's, you know, everything from Castbox to Anchor to Acast to Audio Boom. There's so many to be on. So thinking about which platforms kind of suit you best. And then once you've done that, almost how we do it is we treat each episode as almost a mini PR campaign. So we would be like, okay, this podcast is all around, you know, I don't know, to take Mastercard's financial inclusion. So we can then, how can we PR that? So one, we might have the YouTube piece that we have. We might create an audiogram for social media channels. We might create an op-ed piece as well that we can then push out through to different media channels. And you can use the AI software as well. So you can literally pop that through the whole podcast, and suddenly you get like a document which is literally the whole transcript. It's so cool.
Oh, that's awesome.
So yeah, and there's so much you can do with that. And then thinking about, you know, your host and your people on that podcast, so treating them as your ambassadors to actually use their social followings to push out the podcast too. So there's just there's a lot of different ways. It's almost just like just working it as hard as possible, and then measuring it after a while too. So yeah, it's a good one. Yeah,
because you said that on the webinar is maximizing the asset.
Yeah.
So which is basically what you just talked about, is trying to look at each episode and create as much pieces of content that you can from that episode. And another thing you said, which really like hit home for me, and I was like, after you said it, I was like, ah, shit, okay. So you said that it's great to have a podcast, it's great to have great content, but if no one knows about it, like what are you gaining from that? And when you said that, I was like, yeah, I've been slacking on social media big time. So I was so happy you said it, because it was kind of like the wake up call needed, and like, oh, we got to get back into this world. It's just not a world that I'm a fan of. It stresses me out to make content myself. I'm just not that guy. But we do the best we can. So in terms of promoting the podcast, like you said, there's all those the ways that you mentioned, like audiograms, YouTube, video, and so on. What advice would you have for example, to someone who would want to promote their podcast? Is social media I'm sure that's the most obvious way, but are there other ways to promote that maybe I'm not aware of or people are missing that could prove actually to be very useful?
That's a good one. And social media is probably like the has to be part of the mix, because
of course,
it's so important. But again, we sort of treat each podcast, you know, you're thinking about every single thing. So I guess it goes back to where is your audience, right? So, you know, your audience, if it's a consumer podcast, or even I don't know, maybe it's a podcast about cars. So you then might want to target as kind of the automotive news channels as well. So there'll be kind of like Arab GT, for example. So you could actually then try and use that podcast and that piece of content to actually, when we say sell in, actually create an article where the link to the podcast is in the article. So you're kind of driving listenership viewership from that kind of media publication to listen to your podcast. So we do that quite a lot. So we'll always, with any podcast, write about it. write a blog post or write an article or write just something based on what it's about. And then because there's always interesting content in there. What also is really, so then you can sell that into different magazines and publications and get them to run that article and hopefully embed the podcast link in it or drive people to Apple or SoundCloud or wherever to listen to it. But yeah, other than that, there's a lot of things. I think even just thinking about, it's audio content, so rendering some sound bites. What we've done a few times before is we take out a really powerful sort of 15-20 second quote, and then you can then try and you can look to place that with a radio station, so they can carry that as part of their news bulletins, but also even cross sell your podcast. So if you did go down the kind of ad route, then you can even speak to other podcasts that have the same type of database and audience that you want to attract, and even encourage kind of advertising or doing a short in read or getting them to promote your podcast too. And I do think that's a good thing about this community, is it's not really even with Kerning Cultures with Heather. So she has everyone's very helpful and supportive.
They are.
And a couple of years ago, and it didn't happen this year, but we had the Middle East Podcast Forum, and everyone went there, and it was it was just a really nice community of people, and people came from Saudi, all over the Middle East, and there was just a series of conversations about what the latest is in the podcast space and how we can kind of help content creators and those that are keen to start their podcast and put them in touch with the right people. And she sort of spearheaded that, so that was really amazing to sort of see that come through. But yeah, I think it's just really a combination of everything. When you're promoting your podcast, you're thinking about ultimately where is your audience. Some of them are going to be on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, then you've got YouTube, which is another kind of strategy, because you're suddenly not just going after audio, you're getting
and the video too.
Video.
Yeah, exactly.
Because people listen and consume content in different ways. I sometimes prefer to listen to a YouTube one because you can see it and it feel like it works for me, but then others might just want to just go running or whatever and tune in and zone out and listen to a podcast there. So yeah, there's just a lot of ways. Even with brands, this is on the above the line type of content, but we're doing media partnerships now with brands to promote their podcast. So thinking about things like, I don't know, Business Insider, Forbes, for example, they are now actively promoting podcasts too. So it's just, there's just a lot to do. And I think, I suppose it depends on how how much time, how much budget you have to put behind it. But there's a lot of possibilities.
Yeah, for sure. So it's so interesting listening to how you speak to companies about their podcast, all the factors you're talking about, the audience, what platforms and so on. And I was just listening to you, I've been reflecting back on how I started and everything I've been doing. I'm I just wanted to start a podcast, and I've just gone with it and figured things out and tried to put it on as many platforms as possible.
You're doing amazingly well. Having your a podcast a week, it's brilliant.
Thank you.
And you've got some you've had some great guests, and I was saying before we came on, I listened to the one just yesterday that you did with Ali, and that was super powerful. And you've got an amazing talent for speaking to people and having conversations. It's just what you were saying. Why you started it, and it's just hopefully giving such a good platform to speak to people, and people from this region want to listen to people from here, so it's good to kind of have that.
Thank you so much for the kind words. I really appreciate it. That's very sweet. It is episode a week is very hectic, guys, just so you know. But I like I said, I was telling you earlier, I love it. This is the dream, it's even whatever happens, no matter, I don't know what's going to happen with the podcast in the future. Of course, I'd like this to be my full-time gig eventually. But just the people I've met, the conversations I've had, the amount I've learned, it's so much fun. I just have so much fun doing it. I don't know how to explain it. Obviously, there's a lot of work behind the scenes that goes into it. When I first started, I didn't consider it as work. And now 8 months later and 40 episodes later, I'm no, this is work. no, this takes a lot. Reaching out to people, editing, researching questions. So it's a whole thing. But I think, like you said, it just comes down to what you want out of this podcast. And each person's different. Each person does it in different ways. And one thing you also said in the webinar is that what's most important is the listener experience. So I'm guessing that is the flow of the conversation, audio quality, because I've heard some podcasts that have terrible audio quality. Like I wouldn't, if my podcast had bad audio quality, even I wouldn't listen to it, you know, because that's the only thing I can do. I prefer watching on YouTube personally.
Yeah.
That's why I added YouTube as well. So I just like sitting and watching a podcast. It's like I'm watching a show.
Yeah.
You know, but sometimes if I'm running, okay, yeah, I'll put one on, but my mind goes all over the place when it's just audio. Like when I'm watching something, I'm very focused. I'm like, okay. But the listener experience is important, but also you said a call to action. And that part is what I didn't understand. So when you say a call to action, what do you exactly mean by that? Like what's a call to action for a podcast?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically like getting, you know, if you want people to do something off the back of it, you know, and that doesn't necessarily have to be like for every podcast. But I think, you know, there needs to be a purpose to it. So what is the reason for this? You know, what do we want people to think? Where do we want people to go? You know, if it's a podcast on a specific topic, there might be a link to a site which could tell you more about that. So for example, maybe it's a podcast on, I don't know, baking a cake. You know, you might want to have a link to the recipe. So just a call to action, I think, is important because it helps kind of hone in that conversation. We did an interesting campaign a couple of weeks ago, not through a podcast, but it was all around like this stalkerware cybersecurity software that's actually quite scary. But we did it with the cybersecurity brand, and the call to action was, you know, visit the website if you think you've been affected, and you can find out more and where to go. So I think podcasts are good from that side. You know, if you want to affect change, or if you want people to do something, or if you've got a website and you want people to actually come and follow you so you can actually learn more about you and your life, and actually if there's a link on there to all your other previous episodes, then that would be a great kind of natural call to action. So you know, if you've enjoyed this podcast, you check out my website and you can listen to kind of all the 39 other episodes, and which might be interesting for you. So yeah, call to actions are good. I think sometimes they just help cement your audience and the loyalty factor, because people are listening to this because they've invested in you, they like your style, and how can you kind of make them sort of a real big advocates, and that's one way to do it.
That's true. We will add the call to action for the first time today. But no, thank you. I didn't understand exactly what that meant, but it makes a lot of sense now, like after hearing you explain it. And one thing that you just said about loyalty, and in the stats, you guys said 78% of people don't mind listening to an ad in the podcast, and 68% of people will actually buy the product if there's someone that you follow and that you enjoy. And I was trying to understand. I'm like, what's the reason behind that? Why is that so powerful? I get you're connecting because you're connecting with the person, but couldn't I say the same thing about like a big influencer who like posts about a product? Typically, people are going to buy that product. So if you're comparing the two, like influencer like selling or branding or marketing compared to like a podcast, which do you think is more successful, and why is the other one more successful?
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, I think where hosts win real big, because if you think about radio stations as well, and you think, again, going back to people like Chris Fade, you know, whether you like him or hate him, he has a great sort of personality, and people invest in him. People listen to that podcast because they like him. Yeah. So if he suddenly comes along as part of the kind of broadcast and says, oh, by the way, you know, I've launched, or you might be interested in this, and you know, he has his own kind of Fade Fit brand as well, which is hugely because of the popularity, and people would buy that because they like him. But if he's suddenly kind of endorsing something, then that then carries a lot of extra weight. People like, you know, I listen to Jameela Jamil's I Weigh podcast and a few of Jay Shetty's podcasts, and every so often they talk about a different thing, but it's actually personal to them. It doesn't feel like they're promoting something really random that wouldn't necessarily, you think, fit with them. Like sometimes you wouldn't think, oh, I wouldn't expect them to be talking about that. It's always something that you think that makes sense from like who they are as a person, like and what they talk about. So suddenly it carries that extra weight. And I think because you're so, I mean, podcasts have some of the highest trust levels out of all media because you so buy into that individual, and it becomes this sort of almost like you're part of this intimate conversation where it's just you and that podcast host, and you're just listening to what they say and you trust them. So what they like, you trust their opinion, and that's why you think, okay, that might work for me. Yeah. When comparing it with influencers, I mean, they of course have their own weight and following and
an image and how they are. Yeah.
But sometimes there's so much I guess grey areas with influencers, because you know for sure, well, it's the same with a podcast as well. They've been paid also, but sometimes it just feels a bit more, I think anyways, a bit more commercialized, and you're like, okay, I can see that this post has been sponsored by X brand. They've obviously been paid X to promote this and to say this. But I think it just feels a bit more unobtrusive on a podcast. I don't know why, because it is sort of the same thing, but from the stats that we've seen, like, recall for ads in podcasts is super high. And it's interesting to see, like, actually from our research anyways, how many people that hear a brand mentioned in a podcast actually go on to sort of invest and buy it as well. So
I think the point you mentioned about with influencers, that there can be a gray area sometimes. I was thinking I think you can promote an image on social media very well. You could easily promote, I'm this kind of person, when you're not that kind of person. But I think if you're listening to a podcast and it's a conversation, who you really are is going to come out at some point. I don't think you can filter yourself for like an hour and a half and pretend to be a person that you're not. So maybe that's why in the podcasting world there might be a bit more trust.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I hadn't thought of it that way. And yeah, that's probably true, because you sometimes think on Instagram, you see these videos and you're like, okay, you get like 30 seconds of that person.
Yeah, exactly.
And they probably like rehearsed that and edited it to like the nth degree. So you're kind of like, okay, they look great. It's very polished. But yeah, with the podcast, as absolutely, as you say, like, it's a lot longer form content. I don't know how much you could keep this sort of, so I don't know, facade across, right? So maybe it can be done, who knows? But maybe that is why, and that could be why there's so much trust in them.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing you mentioned about branding, you said that with Jay Shetty's example and so on, the brands the sponsors they have and they've promoted typically are maybe in line with like what they do. Now, let's say you're a podcast, you want to monetize. A brand comes and wants to sponsor you, but has absolutely nothing to do with what the brand of your podcast is and your message. Would you advise someone to take that, or should you be actively seeking out the ones that truly and only resonate with your brand? Because I feel, okay, this is great, you might make some money, but I think the image in the long term, like, it's good in the short term, but the long term, I think it affects your credibility a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. And listeners will see through that. Like,
exactly,
they'll just be like, well, that's strange. Like, why? And that just feels like you're kind of selling out, maybe. Or but equally as well, like, I'd also question it for the brand. Like, why they shouldn't come to you because you're just the face of something and think, okay, right, this person's popular, I want to capitalize on their celebrity, or for example, they need to make sure that for them that they're speaking to the right audience. So usually the tie-ups between the host, the podcast, and the brand are quite seamless, and they work quite well because there's a kind of commonality in terms of what they're trying to do and the audience they're trying to reach. Sure. So it might make sense for a language podcast that's all around, I don't know, learning Spanish or Arabic, to kind of promote like a Rosetta Stone sort of language app.
There you go. Yeah.
Because that makes sense with them. It probably would make less sense for them to promote I don't know, something completely different that I can't think of anything, but they wouldn't even speak to their same audience. But yeah, I guess I know you have to be quite forensic with that as well. But to make sure that the kind of it makes sense, and that kind of that who you are as that individual, the brand, it suits the brand, and likewise as well. Like, for example, we're doing this podcast at the moment for this like amazing financial brand, and the host that we've had to kind of forensically go through their social channels to make sure they're sort of squeaky clean, and they haven't said a tweet 5 years ago that could land them in trouble again, like if they're associated with this. So yeah, again, it's really, you have to do like your due diligence. And I think from a podcast host perspective, or someone who has their own podcast, making sure that you've got a cool brand tie-up, if there is one that you really like working with, and making sure that you're kind of on the same page, your values are the same, you're speaking to the right audience. It seems natural, because otherwise listeners will just see through it. Yeah,
exactly. I haven't had any sponsors in the podcast yet, but my vision has always been, and maybe I'm being naive and maybe it might make me miss some opportunities, but I was always like, if it's a product that I would use or a sponsor that's something that I would actually like use myself, then I'm more than happy to share that, because okay, I'm not pretending like, oh yeah, I use this product, but I really don't. I think that's my vision for it. I don't know if that we'll find out in time what's going to happen, I guess, but that's my vision. At least. I don't know.
That's absolutely, because like, you know, your podcast is almost your personality. It's like,
yeah, exactly.
It's what you're into. So yeah, having something that really like speaks to that is it's super important.
Yeah. And one thing that I've heard some podcasts do from a monetization perspective is licensing. Now, I've never understood this part, and I don't know how it works. So I was hoping you could explain, because my podcast, like many podcasts, this is free content. You could listen to it anywhere. Anyone could play this content. So I don't understand how licensing comes into that. Could you walk us through like how that works?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's still quite a new thing, but for example, like Russell Brand's podcast now in the UK, he's kind of gone on to Luminary, which is the first kind of podcast behind a paywall platform, and that's now you have to pay for it. And that's like, that's very new, but I think maybe that it definitely will be where this whole ecosystem goes. If you think about this, like the most mature podcast markets out there are sort of South Korea, China and Taiwan, and that's how they all consume content. You know, all of their content is behind a paywall.
Really? It's all subscription based?
Exactly.
Wow. Okay. I didn't know that. I didn't know that.
And they've like always been doing that, and they listen to podcasts in a completely different way to how we do it. They listen they're mostly education driven podcasts, so you listen as kind of a form of sort of formal education and learning, whereas that, you know, you don't have the news based podcast, the entertainment based podcast we have out here. So it's different, but yeah, they're kind of they are used to podcasts behind a paywall. And I guess, you know, if you look at how the market's going and how we're sort of closing in terms of listener figures, you know, and now Luminary's kind of launched as the first kind of platform where people have to spend to listen. That might be how it goes. But yeah, the licensing thing is different, and it's a whole sort of new area, and I think that's the kind of interesting thing about this whole platform is that podcasts are quite new in a way, or they're not. I mean, but they are, and it's like just like how things are going. It's like we're all kind of like learning together. But exactly. Even like the Middle East, it's still like it's still a little bit in its infancy. But for sure, like when we were kind of banging the drum for podcasts, you know, for well over a year now, and even when we were trying to sort of sell podcasts kind of last year to brands, they were still a little bit like, oh, is it good? It's a bit new. I think we'll kind of stick with what we're doing. But now everyone's doing them, and they're mainstream, and that's the great opportunity for them. And it's exciting to kind of have this ecosystem where everyone sort of wants to get involved. But I think there's a lot of learning that has to be done, because as you've mentioned, there's some amazing ones, but then there's some kind of terrible ones, to be honest. So it's like trying to find some great content and like actually like then promote them properly, and then go from there. But
that's I never knew that in like the Far East it was all subscription based. That's very interesting, because in my mind the beauty of a podcast and the power of it was always that it was free. You know, that was free content. That's how it had the biggest. That's probably how it's become at the forefront of like media right now, because everyone could get into it, and there were no barriers to entry. I didn't need to pay for something. I can just start one, or I could just go listen to one whenever I wanted. But thinking about like moving forward, I think you're right that subscription, it might become the norm, because I'm thinking about Spotify. Okay, they just bought Joe Rogan's podcast to be exclusive. Now it's for free, but for example, I'm a Spotify subscriber already, so is it still free? Is it free? Yeah. You know what I mean? I was just thinking, I'm like, okay, it might not be like advertised as now I have to. You can have the free version and still listen to it for free, but it gives you that push to be like, maybe I should just, get the subscription, pay for the subscription. Exactly. So it's interesting, yeah. And like
Spotify have done, like, they've been so aggressive in the podcast space. Like they're like the Netflix of the kind of audio world. Like Spotify has been really kind of keen to sort of like wrangle some of the lion's share of the voice away from Apple, and they've done it. Like, and they spec that, I can't remember how much they paid for Joe Rogan's podcast.
100 million.
Yeah, insane. Yeah. Like, and that's like, that is going to literally push them so much further away from Apple. But Apple's, I think, has sort of missed a couple of tricks on the way. But now, like, they have this whole idea with Apple TV and creating podcast series that are exclusive for Apple, then going to be kind of played out there. So are they a bit too late to the game? Like, who knows? But the fact that we've got out here, we've got Deezer now for the Middle East. SoundCloud's a great one. I know that your podcast on that one too. So and Angami's doing well as also. You have Stitcher, you have like Acast, Audio Boom, like Buzzsprout. So there's just these really it's just so many kind of different channels, and they're making, like, as you say, the barrier to entry is low.
It's low, exactly.
Like, people can do it on their smartphone if they wanted to.
Literally,
So
literally, Just get a smartphone, record, and there you go.
Yeah, honestly. And like they're not bad. Like, the fact that tech's getting it's increasing, it's getting more advanced. You can do more with like the devices that you have, and like this, it's essentially just audio and radio on demand. So some good stuff you can do.
Yeah, for sure. I wanted to come back to the PR side of things. So I don't really understand PR personally. Okay, so I wanted to get some advice. And I was thinking, okay, first of all, is when it comes to PR, is doing PR for a brand different than doing it for an individual? Do you understand what I mean? So let's say I'm a company, we come to you, we're like, Cheryl, we'd like you to do our PR for us. Or I'm like a public figure or something. I can come to you and be like, hi, Cheryl, I would also like you to do my PR.
Yeah.
Is it different when you're doing it for an individual and for a company, or do the same rules apply?
I think the same rules do apply, because you're even if you're a person, you're still, that person is, you think of them almost as a brand, They stand for a certain values. They are about a certain thing. They want to be known for a certain thing as well. So like brands and people, like, it's almost, it's the same, but there's always different challenges, and no two brands are the same. Like, it's so, everything you do has to be so specific, and it's so individual. I mean, like, I've been sort of in this industry for sort of 13 years now, and every brief we get, like, it's so different. There's a whole new set of challenges and considerations to think about, and that's kind of what keeps it interesting. But like, it's understanding, like, we've done some PR once for, like, sort of quite senior sort of figures, and for royalty as well, and like managing their reputations. There's probably a lot more that comes into it when it's the individual. Crisis comes, for example, like, thinking about if something badly goes wrong, or someone says something, what do you say? Like, what is the image? How do you damage control, or what do you say to the press? So there's a lot of things about that, but equally as well, like, there's it's just understanding, I think, always going back to the same thing. Who is it that you're trying to speak to, and what do you want them to think about you? That is like is public relations, and it's managing people's reputations, whether that's an individual, whether that's a brand. Like, you're still looking to do the same.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, because like you made a good point that with an individual it might be a little more sensitive. Because like you said, something bad happens, then it's like you're not just defending a company, you're not trying to protect the company, you're trying to protect the individual, which I think could be much more challenging. And I wanted to ask you about this. Do you know the famous saying, there's no such thing as bad publicity? Do you agree or do you disagree, and why?
That's a really hard question. I don't think I think there is such thing as bad publicity for sure, because it can be so damaging. But like, however, there's sometimes actually, and this is an example from back in the UK. There was there's this story. It was on a program called it was ITV's This Morning, and it was basically it called this whole uproar in the Tube in London. There was this big poster, and it was a poster campaign, and it was around. I think it was around, it was basically around these kind of like getting, was it some exercise pills or something? Maybe it wasn't so good because I don't remember the brand, but the actual kind of ad campaign I do remember, and it had this woman in a like bikini on there, and she was saying, I feel great because I'm kind of bikini ready and I'm on holiday, and it's basically down to this brand that I've been able to do that. And that was deliberately deliberately provocative because it caused so much kind of divisive opinion for people and commuters. You know, people are like, how, you know, this is awful that she's been sort of objectified like this, and that's like actually, you know, making people feel bad about themselves, saying this is what you have to do to kind of be this certain way, and it caused this big kind of diversive opinion. I remember being at work at the time, and we when I used to work for Lewis, and we sat around in our press briefing, and we discussed this, and we were like, well, what do you think? Like, is this good? And some of the girls in the office were like, no, this is really bad. And they talked about it on ITV this morning, and they had the marketing person on there, and they talked about why he did it that way, and they said how bad it was, and they tried to vilify him basically. But sales of that brand for this for what they were selling went actually up by about, I think, like 5 times, just literally from that list, people looking at that advert. And it was they got so much sort of bad press from it, but it actually impacted their sales in a massive way.
Exactly.
So can bad press be good? Like, yes, definitely.
Yeah.
But also, like, there are times when, you know, there's a lot of pharmaceutical and medical brands when they've just had constantly sort of bad press, and you know, that then ultimately makes you think a certain way about that company. So then it is super hard. So I definitely think, you know, bad press is bad press. It can be bad for your brand, but then there are ways that you can actually spin it to make a conversation.
Exactly.
So,
yeah. And I can imagine something you said about, like, that's a great example, and how everyone, you know, reacted in that way. And especially, you know, how nowadays everyone, like, globally, like, you know, with cancel culture and all that, it's so, everyone's like so sensitive right now. Like, you have to say, it's almost like if you say something, I'm sorry to you guys, I'm sorry to this, I didn't mean this and that. So for PR, I can imagine that adds like a much higher layer of like pressure, because the image you're trying to put out, you want to make sure you're not ruffling any feathers in other ways. Does that happen with you guys?
Yeah, I think so. And then, but it can be really challenging.
Yeah.
And sometimes when you're working for very like sensitive topics, like when just going back to the Pope's visit to the UAE back in February, that was at a time when there was a lot of bad things happening within the Catholic Church, yet at the same time we were promoting the kind of unity between the Catholic and the Muslim faith kind of coming together. And that could have, although from here this was seen as super positive, you know, great that this, you know, things happening, and in the year of tolerance, what better year to be having this meeting. But globally, media were super cynical about it. They thought, this is strange, you know, why is this happening, you know, these cultures coming together. And it could have been the coverage we got could have been very different. And I think some people, when we talk to people about working on the Pope, they're like, oh, well, that must have been so easy. I mean, obviously all the world's media will cover it. Yes, you know, they will, but that's not the point. The point is that getting to cover it in the right way. It's making sure you're controlling the message. And typically it's how we sort of approached that project, because it's so sensitive, and literally we had 1 million sort of stakeholders up to the highest level.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Laser eyes on everything, and wanting to see everything.
Yeah.
So it was super, super intense.
For my last few questions, Cheryl, number one, I started asking my guests on the podcast this recently, and the reason I started, and the reaction that I've gotten has been pretty amazing, because we get so busy. We're so busy in life. Everyone was thinking of the next goal. I'm working every day. You know, you never take the time to sit back and reflect. So we're going to do that right now. Okay. So looking back over the last few years, what would you say is your proudest moment, or what are you most proud of?
Oh, gosh, wow. That's a really good question.
Yeah, that's usually the reaction.
Wow. For me, like, I suppose for me, like, this probably sounds a bit cheesy, but I think I'm really proud of the fact that we are doing something completely different in this region. When I first came out, it was literally me, a desk, and a phone book of numbers to call and try and encourage people to actually sort of take a punt on an agency that no one had heard of, but do some amazing stuff. And now 6 years on, like, we're, you know, a team of 15, we're still small, but we're working with some of the world's biggest brands. Like, that's what I'm proud of. I'm proud of like what we've achieved as a team. And I work with like some incredible people. Like, they're super talented, they're so passionate, and they're so energetic about what they do. And yeah, it's inspiring to kind of work with people like that actually push you to do something and to make yourself want to be better. So yeah, I guess I'm it's not like a specific moment, but proud of kind of what we've kind of gone, the journey that we've been on, I guess, and what we're still on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, but that's awesome. I think, like you said, to go from sitting at that desk by yourself, calling all those people, I resonated with that so much because I used to work in sales. So my whole life was just that. Cold calling people every day, like, hey, we have a product, would you like it? So I resonate with how hard that was. And congratulations on getting here after 6 years and building what you guys have built. It's pretty awesome. So and I know how much work that probably must have taken, so that's awesome. And for my last question that I ask all my guests, Cheryl, is what is the message that you'd like people to take home with them today?
Wow. You've got some good questions at the end. I feel like what would I think for me, like, I would just say this sounds so cheesy. I need to work on some like less cheesy stuff. It's fine. But I would say, like, someone always told me was to dream big. Okay. Just there's nothing stopping anyone. Like, I grew up in a very small town. Like, I didn't go to a particularly good school. Like, but I think if you're determined and you want to do something and you believe in yourself, I think having a belief is so important, because I used to not. Like, I used to be really, well, I still sort of am sometimes, but I used to be really sort of shy and quite introverted and not at all confident.
Sure.
But it's only really, I think, when people believe in you, for me anyways, and when I was given this opportunity out here, I guess it kind of proved to me that someone kind of trusted what I was doing.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'd say that then instilled a kind of self-belief to be great and to kind of make a difference and to do something that was kind of innovative. So yeah, I'd say, like, that's the message to leave people with. Your only person that's going to hold you back is yourself.
100%.
So go for it.
Go for it, indeed.
And why not? 2020 is the year.
Yeah, if there's ever time to go for it, now is the time. Exactly. Cheryl, I think that's a beautiful message, and I think, myself included, I feel the same way, and I think a lot of people could relate to that and would appreciate that. So thank you so much for your time today and for coming on the show. This has been amazing. It's been so much fun, and I learned so much from you. And I think anyone either looking to start a podcast or a brand looking to work on a podcast, guys, listen to this episode. All the juicy information is right here. So thank you, Cheryl. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Khaled. Thank you. It was great meeting you as well. And yeah, amazing work on this podcast. And thanks for inviting me on.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Guys, to everyone, thanks so much for listening. And as always, hope it helps. Peace.